The dining hall at Ashford Manor had been designed to impress. High ceilings adorned with plasterwork, depicting scenes from classical mythology. Walls panelled in dark oak that had witnessed 2 centuries of family dinners, negotiations, arguments, reconciliations. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazed down from their frames with expressions that suggested they had known something the living had forgotten. Tonight, the room glowed with candlelight. Dozens of tapers burned in silver candelabra, their flames reflected in the crystal glasses that lined the long table. The air smelled of roasted pheasant, of wine from the estate's own cellar, of hothouse flowers arranged in elaborate centerpieces, lilies and roses that bloomed despite the January cold outside. 23 guests sat at the Duke of Ashford's table. They wore their finest evening clothes. The women's gowns rustled with silk and taffeta. Diamonds caught the light at throats and wrists. The men had dressed with the particular care that suggested they understood this was not merely a dinner, but a performance, a demonstration that the old order still held, that civilization persisted, that whatever chaos the new year might bring could be held at bay, at least for one evening, by proper silverware and excellent wine. The Duke sat at the head of the table, his posture so perfectly upright it seemed almost architectural. Thomas Henry Ashford, 6th Duke of Ashford, was 40 years old and looked precisely like what he was, a man who had spent the last 12 years reconstructing an inheritance that had nearly destroyed him. His dark hair was beginning to grey at the temples, not from age but from the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from constant vigilance. His face was handsome in the way of men who have learned to show nothing. Regular features, clear eyes, a mouth that smiled at appropriate moments but rarely betrayed genuine emotion. He wore black evening dress with a precision that bordered on the military, every button fastened, every line sharp. He looked, as he always did, like a man who had never made a careless decision in his life. This was not true, but it was the truth he had constructed for himself, and he had committed to it with the devotion of a monk to his vows. To his right sat his sister-in-law, the Duchess of Ashford. Margaret had married Thomas's younger brother 7 years ago, and when James had died of pneumonia 2 winters past, she had remained at Ashford Manor. Not because she had nowhere else to go. Her own family was wealthy and would have welcomed her back, but because she had grown fond of the place. Fond of Thomas, too, in her way. She organized his household, managed his social calendar, and occasionally looked at him with an expression that suggested she found his relentless self-control both admirable and deeply sad. Tonight, she was in her element. She had planned every detail of this dinner, the menu, the seating arrangement, the timing of each course. She laughed at the right moments, asked questions that drew shy guests into conversation, and generally ensured that the evening moved forward with the smooth inevitability of a well-conducted symphony. The guests were the usual assembly, neighbouring landowners, a member of Parliament, a baronet who had made a fortune in railways, a celebrated poet whose work Thomas privately found overwrought, but whose presence lent the gathering cultural weight. There were several younger peoplers, well, daughters of good families, a few eligible sons, because Margaret believed in the future, even if Thomas did not. And there, 7 places down on his left side, sat Mrs. Eleanor Hartley. She was speaking to Mr. Pemberton, the railway baronet, nodding at something he said. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that was fashionable without being ostentatious. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, not new, Thomas thought, but well maintained. The colour suited her. It brought out the particular clarity of her grey eyes, made her skin seem luminous in the candlelight. She looked, he thought, like someone who had learned to be beautiful without trying. This was not accurate. Thomas had seen her at her morning toilette, not in any improper sense, but because there had been a morning 6 months ago when he had arrived at her house early to discuss some legal matter, and she had received him in her sitting room with her hair still loose, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and he had realized with a force that felt like falling that he was looking at something he wanted more than he wanted his next breath. He had not told her this. He had not told anyone. He had instead finished discussing the legal matter, something about her late husband's property. He could no longer remember the details, and had left with the same courteous formality with which he had arrived. He had walked back to Ashford Manor in the rain, without noticing he was getting wet. He had gone to his study, and sat at his desk and stared at the account books for an hour without seeing them. That had been 6 months ago. Since then, he had visited her precisely 12 times, always with a reason, always with business to discuss, always careful to leave before the conversation could drift into anything that might be called intimate. She had never once suggested he was being foolish. She had never once told him to stay. And now, at this New Year's dinner, she was seated 7 places away, speaking to Mr. Pemberton about railways, and Thomas could not stop watching her. He was aware that he should not be watching her. He was aware that his attention might be noticed. He was aware that there were people at this table who would read meaning into a glance, into the particular quality of his silence when her name was mentioned, but he could not seem to help himself. The main course arrived, roasted pheasant with a reduction of red wine and herbs, accompanied by root vegetables glazed with honey, by potatoes whipped to an improbable lightness, by sauces and garnishes that suggested Margaret had instructed the cook to demonstrate everything she was capable of. The guests exclaimed their approval, plates were filled, conversations resumed. Thomas ate without tasting anything. He was thinking of the last time he had seen Eleanor, 3 days ago at her house. He had gone to deliver some papers related to the final settlement of her late husband's estate. Everything was concluded now. There was no more business between them. He would have no more reason to visit. He had told her this standing in her drawing room, holding the papers in hands that did not shake because he would not allow them to shake. She had taken the papers. She had thanked him. She had said something. What had she said? Something about gratitude, something about his kindness. Her voice had been perfectly even, and he had understood in that moment that she had already begun to let him go. But he had not known how to stop it. He had not known what to say. So he had said nothing. He had bowed. He had left. And now here they were, at his table, surrounded by guests and candlelight and the performance of civilization. And she was 7 places away, and might as well have been on another continent. The dessert course arrived. Margaret had outdone herself. An elaborate construction of spun sugar formed into the shape of a swan, surrounded by candied fruits and small cakes dusted with powdered sugar. It was absurd and beautiful and entirely unnecessary, which was perhaps the point of all beautiful things. The guests applauded. Margaret beamed. The servants began to distribute plates, and then Eleanor lifted her glass. The room did not exactly fall silent, but something shifted. People turned, attention focused. Thomas felt his spine straighten even further, which he would have said was impossible. Eleanor's face was calm. She was not smiling, but neither was she frowning. She looked like someone about to deliver a speech she had rehearsed, though Thomas knew she had not rehearsed it. Eleanor did not rehearse. She simply spoke, and her words had the quality of honesty, which made them more dangerous than any performance. "Your Grace," she said. She was looking at him now, or rather, she was looking in his direction. Her gaze seemed to land somewhere just past his left shoulder, as though she were addressing not him, but some invisible presence that stood behind him. A ghost, perhaps. The ghost of what might have been. "I must thank you," she continued, "for your extraordinary kindness this past year." Her voice was clear, steady, the sort of voice one uses when reading from a prepared text, except there was no text. There was only this: her words, his silence, and the 23 guests who were listening with varying degrees of interest. "Your guidance regarding my late husband's estate," she said, "was invaluable. The matter was complex." Here the slightest pause, as though she were choosing her words carefully, "and you handled it with a grace and efficiency that I could not have hoped for." Someone murmured agreement. Mr. Pemberton, perhaps, or the Member of Parliament. It did not matter who. "Your generosity," Eleanor said the word as though it were a name, as though she were introducing someone to the room, "has been most appreciated. You have been—" Another pause. Longer this time. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. Everything one could hope for. From a man of honor. She lifted her glass slightly. A toast, then. The guests followed suit. Crystal chimed against crystal. "To the Duke of Ashford," Eleanor said, "with gratitude." The guests echoed the toast. They drank. They smiled. Thomas inclined his head. It was the gesture expected of him. Gracious, modest. appropriate. "It was nothing, Mrs. Hartley," he said. His voice sounded to his own ears like it was coming from very far away. "On the contrary," Eleanor replied. She was still not looking at him, still addressing that space just past his shoulder. "It was everything. You have been—" And here she did smile, a small, precise smile that did not reach her eyes, "unfailingly correct in all your dealings with me." Correct. The word landed like a stone thrown into still water. Thomas watched the ripples spread. "I am certain," Eleanor continued, "that the new year will bring you every happiness you deserve, every happiness," another pause, "that you allow yourself to have." She set down her glass. The toast was over. The moment was passing. Already other guests were beginning to speak, to resume their conversations, to return their attention to the elaborate dessert that was being served. But Thomas could not move. He sat at the head of his table, surrounded by candlelight and laughter and the warm glow of a successful dinner, and he understood, with a clarity that felt like a wound, that Eleanor had just released him. She had done it perfectly, politely, with words. That could not be faulted. She had thanked him for his service, acknowledged his honor, and sent him on his way. She had done what he had, through months of careful distance, taught her to do. She had let him go, and he had no one to blame but himself. The dinner continued. Margaret was saying something about the new year, about resolutions, about hope. People were laughing. Someone made a joke about Pemberton's railways. Someone else mentioned a scandal involving a minor aristocrat and an actress. Thomas heard none of it. He was thinking of the conservatory 6 months ago. Eleanor, surrounded by winter jasmine, telling him about her marriage, how she had married because it was expected, how she had confused obligation with love, how she had never told her husband the truth because she thought it would be cruel. "You understand," she had said, and he had understood. He had understood that she was telling him something important. He had understood that she was giving him an opening, a chance, an invitation to speak his own truth. And he had said nothing, because he was Thomas Henry Ashford, 6th Duke of Ashford, and Thomas Henry Ashford did not take chances. Thomas Henry Ashford did not risk. Thomas Henry Ashford had spent 12 years proving he was not his father, and he would not allow himself to become the kind of man who acted on impulse, who followed desire, who made promises he might not be able to keep. He had thought this was honor. He was beginning to suspect it was cowardice. The dessert was consumed. The wine was drunk. Margaret stood and suggested the ladies retire to the drawing room while the gentlemen remained for port and cigars. This was the old way, slightly outdated but still practiced in houses like Ashford Manor, where tradition was not merely observed, but clung to like a life raft. The women rose, their gowns rustled. They moved toward the door in a graceful procession. Eleanor was among them. She did not look back. Thomas watched her go. He watched the line of her shoulders, the way she moved, neither hurrying nor lingering, simply walking with the same self-contained dignity she brought to everything. The door closed behind her. The gentlemen settled back into their chairs. Port was poured. Cigars were offered and accepted. The conversation turned to politics, to business, to the safe topics men discuss when women are not present. Thomas held his glass of port, but did not drink. He held his unlit cigar. He nodded at appropriate moments. He made sounds that suggested he was listening, but he was not listening. He was thinking, "She thanked me," not with love, not with anger, not even with regret. She had thanked him the way one thanks a physician who has done all he can, the way one thanks a solicitor who has handled a difficult matter with discretion. She had thanked him as a service rendered. And the terrible thing, the thing that made his chest ache and his hands tighten around the port glass, was that she was right to do so. He had been a service. He had been useful. He had been everything except what she needed, everything except what he wanted to be. Someone was asking him a question. Pemberton, perhaps. Something about investments. Thomas answered. He did not remember what he said, but it must have been adequate because Pemberton nodded and the conversation moved on. The evening stretched. Time moved strangely, too fast and too slow at once. Finally, Margaret returned with the ladies. The drawing room was warm, filled with the sound of polite conversation. Someone had started playing the pianoforte, one of the younger women, he thought, though he could not remember her name. Thomas moved through the room, speaking to guests, playing his role. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. The art of being present without being there at all. He did not see Eleanor leave. He only realized she had gone when he looked for her and found her absence. Margaret appeared at his elbow. "Mrs. Hartley left early," she said quietly. "She said she had a headache. I hope she's not unwell." "I'm sure she'll be fine," Thomas said. His voice was steady. It gave nothing away. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was difficult to read. Pity, perhaps, or frustration, or both. "Thomas," she said softly. But he had already turned away, already moving toward another guest, already escaping into the familiar refuge of duty and distance. The party wound down. Guests began to depart. Carriages were called, coats were retrieved. There were thanks and compliments and promises to visit soon. Thomas stood at the door, shaking hands, accepting praise for an evening well done. He smiled. He nodded. He said all the right things. And when the last guest had gone, when the house was finally quiet, when even Margaret had retired for the evening, he walked alone through the empty dining hall. The candles had burned low. Shadows gathered in the corners. The table had been cleared, but he could still see where Eleanor had sat. Seventh place down, emerald dress, grey eyes, everything one could hope for from a man of honor. He stood there for a long time, looking at the empty chair, and he knew, with the kind of knowledge that arrives too late to be of any use, that honor without courage is just another word for fear. That correctness is not the same as rightness, that he had protected himself so carefully that he had forgotten what he was protecting himself for. Outside, snow began to fall. The new year had arrived, and the Duke of Ashford understood that he had lost something he had never quite had the courage to claim. The late Duke of Ashford, Thomas's father, Henry George Ashford, had been the sort of man who collected friends the way other men collected stamps or rare books. Everywhere he went, people gravitated toward him. He had a gift for making each person feel as though they were the most fascinating individual in the room. He remembered names, preferences, the small details of lives. He asked after children, inquired about ailments, recalled conversations from years past. He was beloved. He was also, as Thomas discovered 3 weeks after his father's funeral, catastrophically in debt. The discovery came in layers, like an archaeological dig, revealing increasingly disturbing strata. First, there were the obvious creditors, tailors, wine merchants, the usual tradesmen who extended credit to aristocratic families, with the understanding that payment might be delayed but would eventually arrive. Thomas paid these immediately. They were embarrassing but manageable. Then came the moneylenders. His father had borrowed from half a dozen of them, not small sums for temporary difficulties, but staggering amounts that suggested years of systematic financial collapse hidden behind a facade of prosperity. The interest alone was enough to sink a smaller estate. The principal was unconscionable. Thomas was 28 years old. He had been managing one of the estate's smaller properties in Derbyshire, learning the business of land management, preparing, or so he had thought, for an eventual inheritance that was decades away. His father had been 56 and in apparent good health. The heart attack that killed him came without warning, which was typical of the man. Henry George Ashford had lived without warning. He had died the same way. Thomas returned to Ashford Manor and spent 3 days locked in his father's study, going through the papers. Margaret, not yet his sister-in-law, just his brother James's fiancée, had brought him meals that he did not eat. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had tried to speak with him, but he had asked her, as gently as he could, to leave him alone. He needed to understand the full scope of the disaster. It was worse than he had initially calculated. His father had not merely borrowed money. He had guaranteed loans for friends who had defaulted. He had invested in schemes that had collapsed. He had made promises, verbal, nothing written, but promises nonetheless, to support various individuals, fund various causes, maintain various obligations. And somehow, everyone believed these promises would be kept. Because Henry George Ashford had been a man of his word, hadn't he? A gentleman. Honorable. Thomas sat in his father's chair, his chair now, and felt something break inside him that did not make a sound. His father had been charming and beloved and had left his family on the edge of ruin. The estate itself was intact. The land, the house, the title, these could not be seized for debt. But everything else was vulnerable. The investments, the income, the cash reserves, all of it was already spoken for, already committed to creditors who were being remarkably patient only because they assumed a duke would eventually make good on his obligations. Thomas understood what they assumed. They assumed he was like his father. He decided in that moment that he would prove them wrong. He spent 2 years extracting the estate from debt. He sold what could be sold: paintings, furniture, the London townhouse that his mother loved. He negotiated with creditors, offering payment plans, reduced settlements, anything that would prevent legal action. He learned to say no to people who had been accustomed to hearing yes. He learned to disappoint. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. His father's friends approached him with requests, loans, investments, assistance with this or that venture. They approached with the easy confidence of men who had always been helped before. Thomas refused them all, politely, firmly. He explained the situation. He showed them the books. Some understood, others did not. Several stopped speaking to him entirely. He discovered that being beloved is easy when you have money to lend and invitations to extend. It is considerably harder when you have nothing to offer but apologies. His mother took it hardest. The Dowager Duchess had been raised in a world where appearances were everything, where one never ever admitted financial difficulty. The idea of selling the London house, of reducing the household staff, of economizing, these were not merely painful, they were humiliating. "Your father would never have done this," she said one evening, her voice tight with anger. "Father is why I must do this," Thomas replied. She did not speak to him for a month. James, his younger brother, tried to help. He was 24 and kind, and completely unsuited to the sort of ruthless calculation the situation required. He suggested asking relatives for loans. He suggested taking out additional credit. He suggested, with the best intentions, solutions that would only deepen the problem. Thomas loved his brother. He did not take his advice. Instead, he made a plan. A long plan. A plan that would take years to execute, but that would, if he was careful and disciplined and never deviated, restore the Ashford estate to solvency. First, clear the debts. Pay them down systematically, starting with the highest interest rates. Accept no new obligations. Spend nothing that was not absolutely necessary. Second, rebuild the income. The estate's farms had been neglected. Thomas learned agriculture. He read books on crop rotation, drainage, selective breeding of livestock. He visited other estates, studied their methods, implemented improvements. He was not a natural farmer, but he was systematic, and systematic was enough. Third, marry well, or rather ensure that his siblings married well. James was engaged to Margaret, whose family had money but no title. It was a good match. Thomas encouraged it. His 2 sisters, Catherine and Anne, were both intelligent and personable. He arranged introductions, facilitated courtships, made certain they married men who were solvent and decent. He did not consider his own marriage. There was no time. There was no money. There was only the work. By the time he was 34, the debts were paid. The estate was profitable. The Ashford name meant something again, not affection perhaps, but respect. Reliability. A man who honored his obligations. Thomas wore this reputation like armor. He cultivated it deliberately. When people spoke of the Duke of Ashford, they no longer spoke of charm or generosity. They spoke of competence, stability, a man you could trust with your estate, your investments, your secrets. A man who would not disappoint you, except that was not quite true, was it? Because there had been people he had disappointed. His mother, who never quite forgave him for selling the London house. Friends of his father's who had expected continued patronage. Women who had hoped he might court them and found him courteous but distant, polite but unavailable. He had disappointed all of them by refusing to be what they wanted, and he had told himself this was necessary, that he was protecting the estate, protecting his family, protecting the future. He had not allowed himself to consider what he was protecting himself from. Then Eleanor had arrived. It was 2 years ago. James had been dead for 6 months. Pneumonia, sudden and merciless. And Thomas had been moving through his days in a grey fog that he refused to acknowledge as grief. Margaret had stayed at Ashford Manor. She had nowhere else to go, she said, and besides, the house needed a woman's touch. Thomas had not argued. He was grateful for her presence, for the way she managed things, for the buffer she provided between him and the emptiness. One morning, Margaret mentioned that she had invited a widow to call, Mrs. Eleanor Hartley. Her late husband had been a friend of their father's, a minor connection, but a connection nonetheless. The husband had died recently, leaving some legal complications with his estate. Margaret thought Thomas might be willing to offer advice. Thomas agreed. It was the sort of thing he did. Quiet assistance. No expectation of repayment. It cost him. Nothing but time, and time he had. Eleanor arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. She was 30 years old, though Thomas did not know this then. She wore a grey dress, mourning but not deep mourning. The year was past, apparently. Her hair was dark, pulled back simply. No elaborate styling, no attempt to impress. She shook his hand firmly. Her palm was slightly calloused, which surprised him. Later he would learn that she gardened, that she preferred to work with her own hands rather than delegate. Everything to servants. "Thank you for seeing me, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was clear, educated, but without the affected drawl some women cultivated. "I hope I'm not imposing." "Not at all," Thomas said. "Please sit. Would you like tea? If it's not too much trouble." Everything about her was consideration. She sat where he indicated, accepted the tea Margaret brought, and explained her situation with admirable clarity. Her husband had owned a small property, not an estate, just a house, and some land. He had died intestate, which was foolish but not uncommon. There were distant relatives who were making claims. She was not certain of her legal position and could not afford an expensive solicitor. "I'm not asking for charity," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I can pay for your time, but Margaret suggested you might be willing to look at the documents, offer an opinion, if it's too much trouble." "It's no trouble," Thomas said. And he had meant it. It was no trouble. He was good at this sort of thing. Legal documents, property rights, the intricate machinery of inheritance. He could review her papers, write a few letters, possibly intimidate the distant relatives into withdrawing their claims. It would take a few hours spread over a few weeks. Nothing significant. He did not expect to like her, but he did like her. She was intelligent without being performative about it. She listened carefully, asked good questions, did not pretend to understand things she did not. She had a sense of humor that emerged unexpectedly, dry observations delivered with a straight face that made him laugh before he realized he was laughing. He found himself looking forward to her visits. At first they met in his study, formal, proper, always with a servant present or a door left open. They discussed legal strategy, reviewed documents, composed letters to her late husband's relatives. But somewhere along the way, the conversations began to drift. She mentioned a book she was reading. He had read it as well. They discussed it. She had opinions, strong ones, well-reasoned, that differed from his. They argued politely, and he realized with some surprise that he was enjoying himself. The next time she visited, he had another book ready. Something he thought she would like. She did. They began to correspond between visits, letters about books, about ideas, about nothing in particular. He told himself it was friendship, that he was simply being kind to a woman who had lost. Her husband, who needed support, who appreciated his help. He was lying to himself, but he was good at that. 6 months passed. The legal matter was resolved. Eleanor's claim to the property was secured. The distant relatives withdrew. She was safe. There was no more business between them, but the letters continued, and the visits, and the conversations that had nothing to do with legal documents. One evening, in late spring, she mentioned that she loved jasmine. It was blooming in her garden, she said, and the scent reminded her of her childhood. Thomas had jasmine in the conservatory at Ashford Manor, winter jasmine, which bloomed in the cold months. He invited her to see it. She accepted. They walked through the conservatory in the late afternoon light. The jasmine was indeed blooming, small white flowers against dark green leaves, filling the air with a scent that was sweet without being cloying. Eleanor stopped in front of the largest plant, breathing deeply. "Thank you for this," she said quietly. "It's nothing, just flowers." "It's not nothing." She turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression, Vulnerability, perhaps, or simply honesty that made his chest tighten. "I was married for 8 years," she said. "My husband was a good man, kind, thoughtful. We were friends, truly, but I never loved him, not the way—" She stopped, started again. "Not the way one is supposed to love a husband." Thomas said nothing. He did not trust himself to speak. "I married because I was 20 and he was kind and my parents approved," Eleanor continued. "I thought affection would be enough. I thought love would grow. People said it would. They said that fondness could become devotion, that time and proximity would create feeling." "Did it?" Thomas asked quietly. "No. I grew to care for him very much. I mourned him when he died. But I never—" She shook her head. "I never felt what people describe in novels. The passion, the urgency, the sense that your life has rearranged itself around another person. I thought perhaps I was incapable of it, that I was made differently." She looked at the jasmine, not at him. "I thought that until recently," she said. The words hung in the air between them. Thomas felt as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted, as though gravity had changed direction. He should say something. He should tell her. What? That he understood? That he felt the same? That every moment of his day had reorganized itself around the possibility of seeing her? But he said nothing. Because Thomas Henry Ashford was not his father. Thomas Henry Ashford did not act on impulse. Thomas Henry Ashford had spent 6 years rebuilding his family's reputation by being careful, measured, reliable. Thomas Henry Ashford was afraid. So he stood in the conservatory, surrounded by jasmine, and he let the moment pass. "I should go," Eleanor said finally. Her voice was steady. If she was disappointed, she did not show it. "It's getting late." "Oh, of course, I'll have the carriage brought round." They walked back through the house in silence. He helped her with her coat. He watched her carriage pull away, and he told himself he had done the right thing. That restraint was wisdom. That patience was a virtue. That there would be time later to say what needed to be said. He did not understand yet that time is not infinite. That some moments once past do not return. That love postponed is sometimes love lost. But he would learn. Oh, he would learn. Spring arrived with the particular violence of English weather. Cold rain that turned suddenly warm, winds that stripped blossoms from trees before they had fully bloomed, sunshine that lasted 3 hours and then vanished behind clouds. Thomas moved through the season like a man underwater. Everything seemed muted, distant, slightly unreal. He continued to see Eleanor. They still exchanged letters. She still visited Ashford Manor, though less frequently now that there was no legal business to discuss. Margaret had taken to inviting her for tea, for dinner, for small gatherings. This was kind of Margaret, and also transparently calculated. His sister-in-law had opinions about Thomas's solitary life. She expressed them through pointed dinner invitations. Thomas did not object. He wanted to see Eleanor. He simply did not know what to do with the wanting. They had fallen into a pattern that felt both comfortable and agonizing. They talked about books, about politics, about the estate. They walked in the gardens. They played chess. She was good, better than he had expected, and she took a visible pleasure in winning. That made him smile. They did not speak of what had happened in the conservatory. Thomas told himself this was for the best, that he needed time to think, to plan, to understand what he wanted. But this was another lie. He knew what he wanted. He wanted her. He wanted to wake up and find her beside him. He wanted to hear her voice first thing in the morning and last thing at night. He wanted the right to hold her hand without calculation, to kiss her without permission, to build a life that included her in every particular. He wanted all of this with a ferocity that frightened him, because wanting something meant it could be lost. And Thomas had spent 6 years learning to live without wanting anything he could not control. In June, Margaret held a garden party. It was a beautiful day, warm but not hot, with a breeze that carried the scent of roses and cut grass. 40 guests wandered through the grounds, admiring the flower beds, playing croquet, drinking champagne that Thomas could now afford without anxiety. Eleanor was there. She wore a cream-colored dress with pale blue trim, a straw hat to shade her face. She looked lovely, and several men noticed. Thomas watched them notice. He watched them approach her, engage her in conversation, make her laugh. One man in particular, a young officer named Captain Edward Somerset, seemed especially attentive. He was handsome in the way of military men, straight posture, clear skin, confidence born of physical competence. He brought Eleanor a glass of champagne. He said something that made her smile. He stood just slightly too close, in a way that suggested interest but could not quite be called improper. Thomas stood 20 feet away, holding his own glass of champagne, nodding at something the vicar was saying about roof repairs, and felt something dark and acidic rise in his chest. Jealousy. He recognized it intellectually. He had read about it, seen it in others, understood it as a common human emotion, but he had not felt it before. Not like this. Not this combination of possessiveness and helplessness, of wanting to stride across the lawn and physically remove the captain's attention, and simultaneously knowing he had no right to do so. Because Eleanor was not his. He had made certain of that, hadn't he? With his restraint, his patience, his carefully maintained distance, he had made certain she was free. And now someone else had noticed. Margaret appeared at his elbow. "You're glaring," she said quietly. "I am not glaring. You are absolutely glaring. The vicar has stopped talking to you because he thinks you're angry with him." Thomas glanced at the vicar, who did indeed look nervous. "Forgive me," he said. "I was thinking about estate matters." The vicar looked relieved and resumed his monologue about roof tiles. Margaret waited until the vicar had moved on before speaking again. "Captain Somerset is very charming," she observed. "I hadn't noticed." "Thomas," he said nothing. "You cannot simply watch her from across the lawn and expect her to wait forever," Margaret said. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Either speak to her or accept that someone else will. There is nothing to speak about." "Then you are a fool." Thomas looked at his sister-in-law. Margaret was not given to harsh language. The fact that she had called him a fool suggested she thought the situation was serious. "She is not appropriate," he heard himself say. "In what way?" "She is a widow, of limited means. Her family is not—" "Stop," Margaret said, and there was steel in her voice now. "I know every argument you are constructing in your mind, and they are all excuses. She is intelligent, kind, and clearly devoted to you. Her family is perfectly respectable. Her late husband was a baronet. She has been out of mourning for a year. There is no scandal, no impediment, no reasonable objection. My mother would not approve. Your mother approves of nothing that she did not arrange herself. You cannot live your life according to her preferences." Thomas watched Eleanor across the lawn. Captain Somerset was still talking to her. She was listening with polite attention, the way she listened to everyone, but there was no light in her eyes, no animation in her face. She looked like someone enduring a pleasant but unnecessary conversation. "What if I fail her?" Thomas said quietly. Margaret was silent for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer. "What if you already have?" The words hit him like a physical blow. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that he was trying to protect Eleanor, protect them both, protect the careful edifice of safety he had constructed. But he could not say any of that, because Margaret was right. He had already failed Eleanor. He had failed her in the conservatory when she had told him she was capable of love, and he had said nothing. He was failing her now by standing across the lawn while another man occupied her attention. He was failing her through caution, through calculation, through the conviction that love postponed was somehow safer than love claimed. "Talk to her," Margaret said, "or lose her. Those are your choices." She walked away, leaving Thomas alone with his champagne and his cowardice. He did not talk to Eleanor that day. He told himself there were too many people present, that it was not the right time, that he needed to think about what to say. More lies. 2 weeks later, his mother visited. The Dowager Duchess had been living in the dower house since Thomas had paid off the debts and returned the estate to solvency. She came to the main house rarely, and when she did, it was usually to complain about something. Today, apparently, was no exception. They took tea in the drawing room. His mother sat with perfect posture, her back not touching the chair, a posture she had maintained for 40 years and would likely maintain until death. She wore black. She was always in black now, perpetual mourning for her husband, and her face had the particular set to it that meant she had come to deliver an opinion. "There is a young woman," she began without preamble, "the Earl of Pemberton's daughter, Lady Caroline. She is 22, well-educated, and from an excellent family. The Earl is a close friend of mine. He has suggested that an introduction might be arranged. Thomas set down his teacup carefully. I am not looking for a wife. You are 40 years old. You have no heir. The title will pass to some distant cousin if you do not marry and produce a son. Surely you understand your obligation. I understand it perfectly. Then why have you not acted upon it? Because I am in love with someone else, Thomas thought. Because I have spent 2 years circling around a feeling I cannot seem to either embrace or abandon. Because I am trapped in my own carefully constructed prison of restraint. He said none of this. I have been occupied with estate matters, he said instead. His mother's expression suggested she did not believe him. Thomas, your father's errors are not yours to atone for indefinitely. You have rebuilt everything he nearly destroyed. You have restored the family name. You have done your duty. Have I? Yes. And now you must do your next duty, which is to marry and produce an heir. Lady Caroline is suitable. She is pretty, accomplished, and she would make an excellent duchess. I have arranged for her and her father to visit next month. You will meet her. You will consider the match. It was not a request. Thomas looked at his mother. She was 62 years old and had not smiled since his father died. She had lost her London house, her lifestyle, her position in society, all sacrificed to pay for her husband's mistakes. She had never complained, but she had never forgiven either. She sat in her dower house, like an exile in her own life, and she wanted, perhaps needed, to believe that the sacrifices had been for something, that the family would continue, that the title would persist. He could not give her that certainty, but he could give her hope. I will meet her, he said. His mother's face softened minutely. Good. That is all I ask. She left shortly after. Thomas sat alone in the drawing room, staring at nothing. He had agreed to meet Pemberton's daughter. This was sensible, practical, exactly what a duke in his position should do. Lady Caroline was appropriate in every way that Eleanor was not. She was young, titled, suitable for breeding. She would expect nothing from him except children and social position. She would not ask uncomfortable questions or create emotional complications. She would not be Eleanor, but perhaps that was the point. Perhaps he needed someone who was not Eleanor, someone who would not make him feel things he did not know how to manage, someone who would allow him to continue being the man he had spent 12 years becoming, controlled, reliable, safe. He wrote to Eleanor that evening, a brief note. He mentioned that he might be occupied in the coming weeks with family matters. He did not specify what those matters were. He signed it with the same courteous formality he always used. She responded the next day. She understood, she said. She hoped his family matters would resolve well. If he needed anything, he should let her know. The tone was friendly, distant, exactly what one would expect from an acquaintance, not from someone who had stood in a conservatory and told him she had discovered what love felt like. He told himself this was fine. That distance was wise, that he was making the right decision. He almost believed it. July passed in heat and silence. Thomas threw himself into work. There were crops to manage, tenants to visit, accounts to review. He kept busy. He kept moving. He did not think about Eleanor, except every waking moment and in most of his dreams. In August, Margaret cornered him in his study. "Have you spoken to Eleanor?" she asked. "There is nothing to speak about." "Thomas, I am meeting Pemberton's daughter next week. Mother has arranged it. It is a suitable match." Margaret stared at him. "Suitable? Yes. You are making a terrible mistake. Perhaps, but it is mine to make." She left without another word. Thomas returned to his ledgers. The numbers blurred. He could not concentrate. That evening he found himself walking to Eleanor's house. He had not planned to go. He simply started walking, and his feet carried him there, as though his body understood something his mind refused to acknowledge. It was dusk when he arrived. Lights were on in the upper windows. He could see her silhouette moving behind the curtains. She was alone, or appeared to be. He should knock. He should tell her. What? That he had made a mistake? That he wanted her? That he was terrified but willing? But what if she had changed her mind? What if the months of distance had convinced her that he felt nothing? What if she had decided, as she had every right to decide, that she deserved someone who could offer her more than careful restraint and apologetic silence? What if the thing he was trying to protect no longer existed? He stood outside her house for 10 minutes, then 20. He watched her shadow move across the window. He imagined knocking, imagined her opening the door, imagined the conversation. That might follow. He imagined all of it. And then he walked away. He did not see her watching from the window. He did not see the way her hand pressed against the glass. He did not see her turn away when he disappeared into the dark. He walked back to Ashford Manor through streets lit by gas lamps. The night was warm. Somewhere people were laughing. Music drifted from an open window. Thomas walked alone and told himself he had done the right thing. That caution was wisdom. That protecting Eleanor from his own inadequacy was the truest form of love. He believed none of it. But he had spent 12 years learning to lie to himself. One more lie would not make a difference. Lady Caroline Pemberton arrived at Ashford Manor on the first day of September. She came with her father, the Earl of Pemberton, in a carriage that was new and well appointed, the sort of carriage that announced its owner's solvency before a word was spoken. This was not accidental. The Earl was a careful man who understood the language of possessions. Thomas received them in the drawing room. Margaret had organized everything. Flowers arranged just so, tea and small cakes prepared, the room itself configured to suggest welcome without intimacy. She stood beside him as the guests were announced, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture that might have been support or warning. Lady Caroline was exactly what his mother had promised, 22 years old, pretty in a conventional way, with blonde hair and blue eyes and a figure that suggested good health and good breeding. She wore a traveling dress of pale yellow that had probably been chosen specifically for this visit. She curtsied with practiced grace when introduced, murmured something appropriate about being honored to visit Ashford Manor, and then sat where Margaret indicated with the sort of composure that comes from years of training. She was, Thomas thought, exactly what he should want. He felt nothing. The Earl, a man in his late 50s with greying hair and the particular confidence of inherited wealth, dominated the conversation. He spoke of Parliament, of investments, of mutual acquaintances. He was well informed and intelligent, and he made it clear, without quite saying so directly, that his daughter would bring a substantial dowry to any marriage. Lady Caroline herself spoke little. When she did, her answers were brief and carefully calibrated to neither bore nor intimidate. She agreed with her father when appropriate. She smiled at Margaret's attempts to draw her out. She looked at Thomas with an expression that suggested interest without presumption. She was doing everything correctly. Thomas could see the machinery of it, the way she had been prepared for this moment, trained in the art of being suitable. She would make an excellent duchess. She would manage the household with efficiency. She would host dinners and navigate society and produce children, and do it all with the same pleasant competence she was demonstrating now. She would never ask him what he was feeling. She would never stand in a conservatory and tell him she had discovered what love meant. She would never make him feel as though his life had been reorganized around another person's existence. This should have been a relief. It felt like drowning. The visit lasted 3 hours. Margaret showed Lady Caroline the gardens. The Earl discussed estate management with Thomas. They had dinner, a formal affair with all the appropriate courses and wines. Lady Caroline ate delicately and laughed at appropriate moments and revealed nothing of any substance. When they finally departed, promising to visit again soon, Margaret turned to Thomas with an expression of barely controlled fury. "You cannot marry her," she said. "She is perfectly suitable. She is a trained seal performing for fish." "Margaret, I am not saying she is a bad person. I am saying she is a stranger, and you are considering marrying her because she will never make you feel anything. That is not true, isn't it?" Thomas had no answer. Over the next 3 weeks, the courtship, if it could be called that, proceeded with mechanical efficiency. The Earl invited Thomas to visit their estate. Lady Caroline wrote him letters that were grammatically perfect and emotionally vacant. His mother expressed approval. Margaret expressed despair. Thomas felt as though he were watching himself from a distance, observing with clinical interest, as Someone else made the worst decision of his life. He did not contact Eleanor. He told himself this was kindness, that she should not be dragged into his confusion, that she deserved better than a man who could not decide what he wanted. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. He was afraid that if he saw her, he would have to admit what he wanted. Afraid that if he admitted what he wanted, he would have to risk losing it. Afraid that he was fundamentally incapable of being the kind of man who could make someone happy. His father had been charming and reckless and had destroyed his family through careless affection. Thomas had spent 12 years being the opposite, careful, controlled, distant. He had believed this was strength. He was beginning to understand it was just a different kind of weakness. In late September, he attended a dinner at Lord Pemberton's estate. Lady Caroline was present, of course, along with various other members of the Earl's social circle. It was the sort of dinner where everyone understood what was happening, but no one spoke of it directly. They were all watching to see if the Duke would propose, measuring, calculating, waiting. Lady Caroline sat beside him at dinner. She spoke of the weather, of a book she had recently read, of her sister's upcoming wedding. She smiled at appropriate moments. She laughed when something amusing was said. She performed her role flawlessly. Thomas responded in kind. He asked polite questions. He made appropriate observations. He was the Duke of Ashford, and the Duke of Ashford knew how to behave in social situations, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking of Eleanor, of the way she had argued with him about a novel, fiercely defending a character he had dismissed, of how she had beaten him at chess and then immediately set up the board again, saying, "Best of three," of her hands, those slightly calloused hands from gardening, reaching for jasmine blossoms with such tenderness, of the way she had looked at him in the conservatory and told him she had learned what love felt like, and he had said nothing. After dinner, Lord Pemberton requested a private word. They retired to his study, a room filled with expensive books that looked unread and hunting trophies that suggested masculine competence. The Earl poured brandy for both of them and sat behind his massive desk. "My daughter likes you," he said without preamble. Thomas inclined his head. "She is a remarkable young woman. She would make you a fine wife." "I do not doubt it." "Then what is your hesitation?" It was a fair question. Thomas took a drink of brandy to give himself time to formulate an answer. "I want to be certain," he said finally, "that I can offer her what she deserves. You are a duke. You have a substantial estate. You are young enough, healthy. What more could she want?" Everything, Thomas thought. She could want everything. She could want to be loved for herself, rather than for her suitability. She could want a husband who looked at her and felt his breath catch. She could want what every person deserves, to be chosen, truly chosen, not merely selected from a list of acceptable options. But he did not say any of this. "I simply wish to be careful," he said. The Earl nodded as though this made sense. Perhaps it did to him. "Take the time you need, but do not take too long. My daughter will not lack for suitors if you decide to withdraw." It was a gentle threat, delivered with a smile. Thomas understood it perfectly. He left shortly after. The ride back to Ashford Manor took 2 hours. Thomas sat in his carriage and watched the countryside pass, and felt as though he were travelling away from something rather than toward it. Margaret was waiting for him when he arrived home. It was late, past midnight, but she was still awake, sitting in the drawing room with a book she was not reading. "How was dinner?" she asked. "Pleasant. Are you going to propose to her?" Thomas sat down, across from his sister-in-law. He was exhausted, not physically. The day had not been strenuous, but in some deeper way, as though his soul were tired. "I don't know," he said. "Do you love her?" "No." "Could you?" "I doubt it." "Then why are you considering this?" It was the same question Eleanor had asked him in the garden months ago. Why did he speak as though he were not allowed to want anything? "Because," Thomas said slowly, "loving someone means they can hurt you. My father loved carelessly and destroyed our family through his love. He made promises he could not keep. He committed to obligations he could not honor. He loved without thinking, and we all paid for it. Thomas, I have spent 12 years rebuilding what he destroyed. I have made this estate solvent. I have made our name mean something again. I have done it by being careful, by never promising more than I can deliver, by never committing to anything I am not certain I can maintain. And you think loving. Eleanor would be breaking that commitment? Thomas looked at his sister-in-law. Margaret was 32 years old. She had been widowed at 29. She understood loss. What if I fail her? He asked quietly. What if I promise her everything and then discover I am incapable of delivering it? What if I am my father's son after all, charming and earnest and ultimately destructive? You are not your father. How can you be certain? Because your father would never have asked that question. The words hung between them. Thomas wanted to believe them. He wanted to believe he was different, that his caution was wisdom rather than cowardice, that his restraint was protecting Eleanor rather than hurting her. But he could not shake the feeling that he was making the same mistake his father had made, just inverted. His father had loved recklessly. Thomas was refusing to love at all. Both paths led to ruin, just different kinds. Talk to Eleanor, Margaret said. Tell her what you are afraid of. Let her decide if she wants to take the risk. What if she decides she does not? Then at least you will know. Thomas nodded. It was reasonable advice, wise even. He did not follow it. Instead, he spent the next 2 weeks moving between Ashford Manor and Pemberton's estate, meeting with Lady Caroline, allowing the courtship to progress through sheer inertia. He did not propose, but he did not refuse the possibility either. He existed in a state of suspension, neither committing, nor withdrawing, waiting for, what? A sign? Divine intervention? Someone else to make the decision for him? He was, he realized with something like horror, becoming his father after all. Not through recklessness, but through paralysis. Not through careless promises, but through inability to promise anything at all. In mid-October, he received a letter from Eleanor. It was brief. She had heard, she wrote, that he was courting Lady Pemberton's daughter. She wished him every happiness. The match sounded suitable. She hoped he would be content. The words were correct. The tone was final. She had released him. Not with drama or accusation, but with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything. She had understood, of course she had understood, that his silence was an answer, that his absence was a choice, that his courtship of another woman was a statement clearer than any words. And she had let him go. Thomas read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer as though filing away something important, but concluded. He should have felt relief. He should have felt free. Instead, he felt as though something essential had been amputated. But he did not change course. He continued to visit Pemberton. He continued to spend time with Lady Caroline. He moved forward because he did not know how to move backward, and stopping meant facing what he had done. So he kept moving. And he told himself, with decreasing conviction, that this was the right thing. That protecting Eleanor from his inadequacy was a form of love. That duty was more important than desire. That he was doing what a responsible man should do. All lies. But Thomas Henry Ashford had become very good at lying to himself. It was, perhaps, his greatest talent. November arrived with cold rain and grey skies. The landscape around Ashford Manor turned brown and dormant. Trees stood bare against low clouds. The gardens that had been so beautiful in summer now looked skeletal, waiting for winter to either finish them or allow them to sleep. Thomas moved through his days in a state of numb functionality. He managed the estate. He corresponded with tenants. He reviewed accounts. He visited Pemberton's estate twice more. Lady Caroline was pleasant. His mother was approving. The Earl spoke of spring weddings and suitable settlements. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. Thomas felt as though he were dying by degrees. Margaret stopped speaking to him about Eleanor, not from approval but from exhaustion. She had said what she could say, she had made her arguments. He had not listened, or had listened and chosen differently, which amounted to the same thing. So she retreated into cold politeness, managing the household with her usual efficiency, but no longer seeking his company or offering unsolicited opinions. He missed her commentary more than he would have expected. In the 3rd week of November, he attended a charity event in the nearby town. It was the sort of thing he had to attend. The Duke's presence lent prestige, encouraged donations, demonstrated that the aristocracy cared about the less fortunate. He had learned to play this role well. He smiled. He made small contributions that would be mentioned in the local paper. He spoke to organizers with apparent interest. And then he saw her. Eleanor was across the room, speaking with the vicar's wife. She wore a dark blue dress, simple, well-made, elegant, without extravagance. Her hair was pinned up loosely, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She was listening to something Mrs. Preston was saying, nodding, her expression attentive. She had not seen him, or if she had, she gave no indication. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He had not seen her in 6 weeks. 6 weeks since his last visit to her house to deliver those final legal documents. 6 weeks since he had stood in her drawing room and failed to say anything that mattered. She looked thinner, he thought. Or perhaps he was imagining it. Perhaps he was projecting his own sense of loss onto her, creating evidence of mutual suffering where none existed. He should leave. He should make his donation and his excuses and retreat before she noticed him. Instead, he walked toward her. He did not decide to do this. His body simply moved, carrying him across the room as though pulled by something stronger than volition. He arrived at her side before he had formed any idea of what he might say. "Mrs. Hartley," he said. Eleanor turned. For a fraction of a second, so brief he might have imagined it, something crossed her face. Pain, perhaps, or anger, or simply recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by polite courtesy. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "What a pleasant surprise." Mrs. Preston looked between them with undisguised interest. "I did not realize you two were acquainted. The Duke was kind enough to assist me with some legal matters earlier this year," Eleanor said. "His help was invaluable." Past tense had been. "Mrs. Hartley is too generous," Thomas said. "It was nothing." "Nevertheless," Eleanor said, "I am grateful." There was that word again. Grateful. As though he had performed a service, as though there had never been jasmine in a conservatory, or letters about books or chess games that lasted until the fire burned low. Mrs. Preston excused herself, probably to spread news of this encounter to every other person at the event. Thomas and Eleanor stood together, in the corner of a room full of people, and might as well have been alone. "I hear congratulations are in order," Eleanor said. Her tone was light, conversational. "Your courtship of Lady Pemberton is the talk of the county. It is not yet settled, but it will be, I imagine. Perhaps." She looked at him then, really looked, and for a moment her careful facade slipped. "Thomas, what are you doing?" The use of his given name struck him like a blow. She had not used it before. Always, "Your Grace" or "Duke" or nothing at all. The familiarity of it, combined with the genuine confusion in her voice, nearly undid him. "I am doing what is expected," he said. "Expected by whom?" "Everyone. My mother, the estate, society. Everyone except yourself." He had no answer for that. Eleanor shook her head slowly. "I thought—" She stopped, started again. "For months, I thought perhaps you simply needed time, that you were cautious, careful, and that eventually you would—" She trailed off. "But you are not cautious, are you? You are afraid." "Eleanor, do not marry her," Eleanor said quietly, urgently. "Do not marry someone you do not love because you think it is your duty. I did that. I spent 8 years living beside someone I cared for, but did not love. And I would not wish that on anyone, not on you, not on her. Lady Caroline understands what the marriage would be. Does she? Have you told her that you feel nothing for her? That you are marrying her because she is suitable? And will never ask anything difficult of you? That is not—" "It is exactly that," Eleanor said. Her voice was still quiet, but there was steel in it now. "You are choosing safety over happiness, duty over desire, and you are telling yourself it is noble when it is simply fear. What am I afraid of?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Of being your father," Eleanor said. "Of loving recklessly and destroying everything. So instead, you are choosing to love not at all, and you think that is somehow better." She was right. Of course she was right. Thomas had spent months constructing elaborate justifications for his caution, and Eleanor had cut through all of them in 30 seconds. "I cannot," he began. "Cannot what? Cannot risk, cannot fail, cannot be human." She shook her head. "I am not asking you to be reckless, Thomas. I am asking you to be brave enough to want something. I want—" He stopped. The words were there, had been there for months, but he could not force them out. Even now, even with her standing in front of him, offering him one more chance, he could not speak. Eleanor waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then she nodded, as though confirming something she had suspected. "I wish you every happiness," she said. The words were the same ones from her letter. Final, conclusive. "Truly, I hope Lady Caroline makes you content." "Eleanor, please." But she was already walking away. Not hurrying, not dramatic, just walking with quiet dignity toward the door. Thomas watched her go. He could have followed. He could have called her name. He could have done any number of things that might have changed what happened next. He did none of them. He stood in the corner of a room full of people who were all pretending not to watch, and he let her leave. Again. Always. The charity event continued. Thomas made his donation. He spoke to the organizers. He fulfilled his obligations. Then he returned to Ashford Manor and went directly to his study. He sat at his desk for a long time, staring at nothing. Margaret found him there an hour later. "I heard you saw Eleanor at the charity event," she said. Thomas did not ask how she had heard. Margaret always knew everything. "Yes." "Did you speak to her?" "Briefly." And nothing. She wished me happiness. I wished her the same." Margaret sighed. It was a long sigh, full of disappointment and resignation. "Then I suppose that is that." "Yes." She left without another word. Thomas remained in his study. Outside, rain began to fall. He listened to it tap against the windows, steady and relentless. He thought about Eleanor's words. "You are choosing safety over happiness." Was that what he was doing? Or was he choosing responsibility over selfishness? Duty over desire? How did one tell the difference? His father had chosen desire and destroyed their family. Thomas was choosing duty and destroying himself. Neither seemed like wisdom. He opened his desk drawer and retrieved Eleanor's letter. The one, where she had released him. He read it again, searching for some hidden meaning, some suggestion that she had not meant it. There was none. The words were clear. She had understood his silence as refusal. She had let him go, and he had allowed it, because he was afraid. Eleanor was right about that. He was afraid of failing, afraid of hurting her, afraid of discovering that beneath his carefully constructed competence was nothing but his father's recklessness waiting to emerge. So he had chosen to hurt her differently, through absence rather than presence, through withdrawal rather than commitment. It was, he thought, a very sophisticated form of cowardice. The rain continued. The fire in the grate burned low. Thomas sat in his study and understood with perfect clarity that he had made an irreversible mistake. He had lost Eleanor, not through circumstance or misfortune, but through his own deliberate choices, through months of careful distance, of calculated restraint, of choosing. Safety over risk. He had protected himself brilliantly and lost everything that mattered. The next morning he wrote to Lord Pemberton, a brief note. He appreciated the Earl's hospitality and Lady Caroline's company, but after careful consideration, he did not think the match would be suitable. He hoped the Earl would understand. He wished Lady Caroline every happiness. It was the right thing to do. He should have done it months ago, but better late than catastrophically too late. Pemberton wrote back immediately. He did not understand. Lady Caroline was devastated. The family was embarrassed. Thomas's behavior was ungentlemanly. There would be talk. Thomas read the letter without emotion. Let there be talk. He had spent 12 years building a reputation for reliability. Perhaps it was time to demonstrate that he was capable of being unreliable. His mother was furious. She arrived at Ashford Manor the day after Pemberton's letter, announced by the butler, sweeping into Thomas's study without knocking. "How could you?" she demanded. "You have embarrassed that family. You have embarrassed this family. You have made us all look ridiculous." "I apologize," Thomas said, "but I could not marry her." "Why not?" "Because I do not love her." His mother stared at him as though he had spoken in a foreign language. "Love? What does love have to do with it? Marriage is about alliance, about family, about duty. Your father loved me, and look where that led. Ruin, debt, humiliation." "Father's problem was not that he loved you," Thomas said quietly. His problem was that he was irresponsible. Love and responsibility are not opposites. You sound like a romantic novel. Perhaps I do. His mother was silent for a moment. Then she said more quietly, "Is this about that widow, Mrs. Hartley?" Thomas did not answer immediately. His mother took the silence as confirmation. "She is not suitable," she said. "She is more suitable than anyone I have ever met. She has no fortune, no connections. She will bring nothing to this family. She will bring herself, that is enough." His mother looked at him with something that might have been pity or might have been disgust. "Then you are a fool, just like your father." She left. Thomas sat in his study and thought, perhaps I am. Perhaps choosing to love despite the risk makes me a fool. Perhaps wisdom would be to marry someone suitable and safe and spend the rest of my life pretending to be content. But he was tired of pretending. He was tired of caution. He was tired of being the Duke of Ashford instead of Thomas Ashford, a man who wanted something and was willing to risk everything to claim it. So he made a decision. He would go to Eleanor. He would tell her everything. His fears, his failures, his recognition that he had been wrong. He would apologize. He would ask, not for forgiveness, but simply for a chance. One chance to prove he could be braver than his fear. She might refuse. She might have already. Moved on, decided he was not worth the trouble, found someone else who could offer her what she deserved. But he would ask anyway, because Eleanor had been right. He needed to be brave enough to want something. And what he wanted was her. He decided he would go to her house the next morning. He would not send a letter asking permission. He would simply arrive and hope she would see him. It was not much of a plan, but it was honest. And honesty, Thomas was beginning to understand, was more important than elegance. He went to bed that night feeling lighter than he had in months. Afraid, yes, uncertain, absolutely, but also somehow more alive, as though he had been holding his breath for 12 years and was finally remembering how to exhale. Tomorrow he would tell Eleanor the truth. Tomorrow he would risk everything. Tomorrow he would stop being the Duke of Ashford and start being simply Thomas. It felt like falling. It felt like flight. He did not know which it was, but he was, finally willing to find out. And then Margaret decided to host a New Year's dinner. Thomas had forgotten about it until she mentioned it 3 days before. It was a tradition she had started when James was alive, a gathering to mark the turning of the year, to bring together neighbors and friends, to demonstrate that Ashford Manor was still a place of warmth and hospitality. "You do not need to host it this year," Thomas said, "given everything." "Given what?" Margaret asked. "Given that you have finally shown some sense by ending things with Pemberton's daughter. That seems like something to celebrate." "Mother disagrees." "Your mother disagrees with the sunrise. I am hosting the dinner. You will attend, and—" She paused, considering. "I have invited Eleanor." Thomas felt his heart stop. "You did what?" "I invited Eleanor. Why should I not? She is our friend. She has been kind to this family. The fact that you have been an idiot does not change that." "Margaret, I was planning to visit her, to speak with her privately. If she comes to the dinner, if there are all these people, then you will need to be creative," Margaret said. She did not sound sympathetic. "You have had months to speak to her privately. You did not. Perhaps a bit of social pressure is what you need." Thomas wanted to argue, but he had no grounds. Margaret was right. He had wasted months. He had no right to demand perfect circumstances now. "Did she accept?" he asked. "She did." "Did she—" He stopped, started again. "Did she say anything about me?" Margaret's expression softened slightly. "She asked if Lady Pemberton would be in attendance. When I said no, she accepted. Make of that what you will." Thomas made of it that Eleanor was willing to be in the same room with him, but not to witness his courtship of another woman. This was something. Not much, but something. The next 3 days passed in a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. Thomas rehearsed what he might say to Eleanor. Then abandoned those speeches as too formal. Then created new ones. Then abandoned those as too casual. By the time the dinner arrived, he had no idea what he would say. He decided he would simply be honest, tell her the truth without artifice or calculation. This felt both liberating and terrifying. The dinner guests began arriving at 7. Thomas stood in the entrance hall, greeting them with the courtesy that had become second nature. Lord and Lady Harrison, the vicar and his wife, Mr. Pemberton, the railway baronet, not related to the Earl, just unfortunate naming, and his sister, various others, the usual assembly. And then Eleanor arrived. She wore the emerald dress, the same one she had worn at the dinner 6 months ago, when they had first begun to move beyond legal formalities into something more dangerous. She looked beautiful and tired and wary. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Thomas felt everything he wanted to say crowd into his throat, blocking speech entirely. "Mrs. Hartley," he managed, "thank you for coming." "Your Grace," she replied, formal, distant, as though they were strangers. Perhaps they were. Margaret swept in and drew Eleanor away toward the drawing room. Thomas was left standing in the entrance hall, feeling as though he had failed some crucial test before it had even begun. The dinner itself was torture. Eleanor was seated 7 places down on his left, the same position as before. Margaret had done this deliberately, Thomas thought. A reminder of what had been lost. The meal proceeded with the usual rituals. Courses arrived and were consumed. Conversations rose and fell. People laughed at appropriate moments. Everything was civilized and correct. Thomas ate without tasting anything. He was hyper-aware of Eleanor's presence, the way she listened to Mr. Pemberton discuss railways, the way she nodded at something the vicar's wife said, the way she was perfectly polite, perfectly appropriate, perfectly unreachable. He wanted to stand up and shout. He wanted to demand everyone leave so he could speak to her alone. He wanted to apologize to the entire room for being an idiot and then beg Eleanor to give him one more chance. He did none of these things. He sat at the head of his table, the Duke of Ashford, and he played his role. And then the dessert arrived. Margaret's elaborate creation, spun sugar and candied fruit and small cakes. The guests applauded. Margaret beamed, and Eleanor lifted her glass. Thomas felt every muscle in his body tense. He knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened next would be irreversible. "Your Grace," Eleanor said. She was looking at him now, actually looking at him, not at a space past his shoulder, but at him. Her grey eyes were clear and sad and final. "I must thank you for your extraordinary kindness this past year," she said. The words landed like stones, each one weighted, each one chosen with precision. "Your guidance regarding my late husband's estate was invaluable. The matter was complex," the slightest pause, "and you handled it with a grace and efficiency that I could not have hoped for." Someone murmured agreement. Thomas could not identify who. He was drowning. "Your generosity," Eleanor held the word for a heartbeat, "has been most appreciated. You have been everything one could hope for from a man of honor." She lifted her glass. The other guests followed. "To the Duke of Ashford," Eleanor said. "With gratitude," Crystal chimed. People drank. People smiled. Thomas inclined his head. "It was nothing, Mrs. Hartley." The words were ash in his mouth. "On the contrary," Eleanor said, "it was everything. You have been unfailingly correct in all your dealings with me." "Correct," the word echoed in his skull. "Correct, not kind, not loving, not passionate. Correct." "I am certain," Eleanor continued, and her voice was steady, utterly steady, "that the new year will bring you every happiness you deserve, every happiness that you allow yourself to have." She set down her glass. The toast was over, and Thomas understood. She was releasing him, completely, finally, with words that could not be misinterpreted or later reclaimed. She was thanking him for his service and sending him on his way. She had done what he had, through months of silence, taught her to do. She had let him go, with perfect courtesy, with impeccable manners, with the grace he had always admired in her. She had let him go. The dinner continued. Conversations resumed. The moment passed into history, but Thomas could not move. He sat frozen, understanding that he had just witnessed the end of something that had never quite begun, that he had spent months constructing elaborate justifications for his caution, and Eleanor had responded by treating him exactly as he had treated her, with politeness, distance, and finality. She had learned the lesson he taught, and now he would live with the consequences. The meal ended. The guests moved to the drawing room. Someone started playing the pianoforte. People sang. Old songs about new beginnings, about hope, about the turning year. Thomas moved through the rooms like a ghost. He spoke when spoken to. He smiled when smiles were expected. He fulfilled every social obligation, and he watched Eleanor prepare to leave early. She was making her excuses to Margaret, something about a headache. Margaret looked skeptical, but did not press. Eleanor collected her coat. She moved toward the door. Thomas followed. He caught her in the entrance hall just as she was pulling on her gloves. "Eleanor," he said. She turned. Her expression was carefully neutral. "I need to—" He stopped. How did one begin? How did one apologize for months of cowardice? "I need to speak with you. I think we have said everything that needs to be said." No, we have not. I have not. Please, 5 minutes. That is all I ask." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Thomas saw her consider refusing, saw her weigh the cost of staying against the relief of leaving, saw her finally nod. 5 minutes, she said. He led her to his study. It was the only room in the house that was guaranteed to be private. He closed the door, improper, but he was past caring about propriety, and turned to face her. She stood in the middle of the room, her coat still on, her gloves still fastened, waiting. "I have been a fool," Thomas said. It was not the eloquent opening he had planned, but it was true. Eleanor said nothing. "I have been a fool," he continued, "and a coward, and I have hurt you through my caution, and I am—" His voice cracked slightly. "I am so sorry." Still, she said nothing. Her face revealed nothing. "I told myself I was protecting you," Thomas said. "I told myself that by keeping my distance I was preventing future pain. I told myself that my restraint was noble. But the truth is simpler and worse. I was afraid." "I know you were afraid," Eleanor said quietly. "I told you that at the charity event." "You did. You were right. I was afraid of being my father, of loving carelessly and destroying everything. So I chose to love not at all, and I thought—" He stopped, forced himself to continue. "I thought that was somehow better." Was it? No. It was worse. It was cowardice dressed as wisdom. Eleanor's expression softened minutely. Not forgiveness, just acknowledgement that he was finally being honest. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "After months of silence? After courting another woman? After—" Her voice finally showed emotion, anger or pain or both. "After teaching me to let you go? Because I was wrong. Because I have spent the last few days understanding what I have lost. Because—" He took a step toward her. "Because you said I needed to be brave enough to want something, and I do want something. I want you." The words hung between them, simple, unadorned, true. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were wet. "Thomas, I cannot—" She shook her head. "I cannot wait anymore. I cannot be the person who hopes you will change your mind. I did that for months. I made excuses for your silence. I told myself you needed time, but time is not the problem. You are the problem." The words were harsh but not cruel. They were simply true. "You are so afraid of failing," Eleanor continued, "that you cannot allow yourself to try. You are so committed to being correct that you have forgotten how to be happy. And I—" Her voice broke. "I deserve someone who is willing to risk something for me." "I am willing," Thomas said desperately. "I am willing now. But for how long? Until you become afraid again? Until some new doubt convinces you that loving me is dangerous? I cannot live with that uncertainty." "Neither can I," Thomas said, "which is why I am asking you to give me one chance. One chance to prove that I can be braver than my fear. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am asking for an opportunity." Eleanor was crying now, tears sliding down her face without sound. "You broke my heart," she said. "You did it slowly, politely, but you broke it nonetheless. And you did it because you were too afraid to risk yours. I know, and I am sorry. And I understand if you cannot forgive me, but Eleanor—" He moved closer. She did not step back. "I love you. I have loved you since the conservatory, since before the conservatory, since the first time you argued with me about that book, and I realized you were the most extraordinary person I had ever met." "Love is not enough," Eleanor said. "Not without courage, not without commitment." "I am committed," Thomas said. "I know I have given you no reason to believe me. I know I have demonstrated the opposite, but I am asking you, no, I am begging you to let me prove it. Let me prove that I can be the man you deserve." Eleanor was silent. She looked at him with an expression that contained too many emotions to pass. Love, anger, hope, despair, all of it, tangled together. "How?" she asked finally. "How do you prove that?" "By choosing you, every day. By refusing to let fear determine my actions. By—" He stopped. "By asking you to marry me." The words were out before he had consciously decided to say them. But the moment they were spoken, he knew they were right. Eleanor stared at him. "What?" "Marry me," Thomas said. "Not someday, not eventually. Now, soon, as soon as it can be arranged. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that I can be brave enough to love you properly. Thomas, I know this is sudden. I know I have given you every reason to refuse, but I am not asking you to trust my past behavior. I am asking you to trust my future intentions. I am asking you to be reckless with me, to take the risk I was too afraid to take." Eleanor was shaking her head, but she was also smiling through her tears. "You are impossible." "I am in love. Apparently, it makes one irrational." She laughed. It was a broken sound, half sob, half joy. "You have terrible timing. I know. You have put me through months of pain. I know. I should refuse you." "You should," Thomas agreed. "It would serve me right." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, seeing perhaps past the Duke to the man beneath, the man who had spent 12 years building walls and was now trying, desperately, to tear them down. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "and you change your mind, if you wake up one morning and decide this was a mistake, I will not. You cannot know that. You are right. I cannot know the future. I can only make a choice about it. And I choose you. I choose the risk of loving you over the certainty of losing you. That is the only promise I can make. But I make it completely." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Thomas waited. He did not push. This was her decision. He had made his offer. The rest was up to her. Finally, she spoke. "No," she said. Thomas felt his heart stop. "No, no, I will not marry you." The disappointment was physical, crushing. He had asked and she had refused, and he had no right to feel surprised, but he felt surprised anyway. "I understand," he said. "I do not blame you. I will not marry you now," Eleanor interrupted. "But ask me again in 6 months." Thomas blinked. "What? 6 months? If in 6 months you still want to marry me, if you have not talked yourself out of it, if you have not found some new reason to be afraid, if you can spend 6 months living as though you are committed to me before you are legally bound to me, then I will say yes." Thomas understood. She was not refusing him. She was testing him, asking him to prove his commitment before she risked her heart again. It was fair. It was wise. It was everything he should have done months ago. 6 months, he agreed, "but I will court you openly. I will not be discreet or careful or appropriate. I will tell everyone who asks that I am in love with you. I will make my intentions unmistakable." Helena smiled. It was a real smile this time, reaching her eyes. "Your mother will be furious. My mother is already furious. At this point, I might as well earn it." She laughed. Then, slowly, she removed her gloves, unfastened her coat, set them aside on a chair. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked. "Staying," Eleanor said. "For now. We have the rest of the evening, do we not? We might as well use it." And so they did. They talked. Not about the future, not about plans or promises. Just talked. About books and ideas and nothing in particular. The way they had in the beginning, before fear had complicated everything. It was not reconciliation. Not yet. But it was a beginning. An honest beginning. Outside, the new year arrived. Somewhere people were celebrating, singing, hoping for change. In Thomas's study, 2 people sat by the fire and talked until the candles burned low. It was enough. For now, it was enough. This story is a work of fiction, created for emotional reflection and storytelling. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental. They married in July. A small ceremony, just family and close friends. No grand society event, no elaborate performance. Eleanor wore a simple dress of cream silk. Thomas wore his best coat and looked nervous, which made her smile. When the vicar asked if he took this woman as his wife, Thomas did not hesitate. "I do," he said, and he meant it. Their marriage was not perfect. He still struggled with caution. She, still worried that he might retreat into his careful distance. They argued occasionally. They disappointed each other in small ways. But they chose each other, every day, even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult. Because that, Thomas learned, was what love actually meant. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Not the promise of certainty, but the commitment to try. His father had loved recklessly and destroyed his family. Thomas loved carefully and built one. It was not the same as his father's love. It was better, because it combined passion with responsibility, desire with commitment, feeling with choice. He was not his father. He was himself. And that finally was enough. Eleanor told him this one evening years later, when they were old and their children had children, and the estate had passed to capable hands. They were sitting in the conservatory. The jasmine was blooming. It always bloomed for her. "You were afraid you would be like your father," she said, "but you were never like him. You were always yourself." "And that is good?" Thomas asked. "That is everything," Eleanor said. She took his hand. He held it. They sat together in the scent of jasmine, and the weight of years lived together. It was, Thomas thought, the happiness he had always been afraid to want. The happiness he had almost talked himself out of having. The happiness that had required, in the end, only one thing: the courage to choose it. And to keep choosing it every day, even when he was afraid, especially when he was afraid. What makes a life well lived is not the absence of fear, but what we do with it. Thomas spent 12 years building walls to protect himself from becoming his father, and nearly became a different kind of failure in the process. Not through recklessness, but through paralysis. Not through careless love, but through refusing to love at all. Eleanor saved him by refusing to wait forever, by demanding that he be brave, enough to want something, by teaching him that love without risk is not love at all. It is just well-mannered cowardice. The lesson is not that caution is wrong. It is that caution taken too far becomes its own kind of destruction. That protecting yourself from pain can mean protecting yourself from joy. That the real courage is not in avoiding mistakes, but in allowing yourself to be human enough to make them. Thomas learned to love carefully, but he learned to love. He learned that commitment and passion are not opposites. That responsibility and desire can coexist. That being unlike his father did not mean being unlike himself. And Eleanor learned that love must be chosen, not merely felt. That she deserved someone willing to risk something for her. That patience is a virtue only when it is not mistaken for indefinite waiting. They both learned that the most important promises are not made once, but remade every day. That marriage is not a destination, but a continual choice. That love is both the most reckless and most responsible thing we can do. If there is a lesson in their story, it is this: do not wait so long to claim your happiness that you forget what happiness feels like. Do not protect yourself so carefully that there is nothing left to protect. Do not confuse dignity with distance or honor with avoidance. Choose, risk, love, even when you are afraid, especially when you are afraid. Because the only thing worse than choosing and failing is never choosing at all.